The office was too quiet when Renata walked in on a Tuesday morning and found her husband's calendar cleared for the rest of the month. Not rescheduled, not moved, cleared. She stood in the doorway of the home office they'd converted together from what used to be a guest room. The room where her mother had stayed when she flew in from Halifax for the wedding. And she stared at the screen he'd left open by accident. Or maybe not by accident. Maybe Trent had stopped being careful because he'd stopped thinking she was paying attention. That was his first mistake. Renata Osieweller had spent 11 years being the kind of wife who didn't make a fuss. She brought coffee to client meetings. She remembered birthdays of people who weren't her family. She moved her freelance writing career to the background. When Trent's consulting firm started growing, and he needed someone who could be flexible, available, present. She'd been present for all of it. For the late nights in the early years when they were building something together. For the dinners with investors where she smiled and said the right things and made Trent Weller look like a man who had everything sorted. For the pregnancy that didn't make it past 14 weeks, which they'd told no one about, which Renata had grieved alone in the bathroom of their Westmount home while Trent took a call in the kitchen. She'd been present for all of it. And now she was looking at a calendar that said her husband had nowhere to be for the next 4 weeks. When he'd told her just last Sunday that November was going to be brutal, that he might miss Thanksgiving dinner, that she shouldn't wait up. Renata closed the office door quietly. She went to the kitchen. She made herself a cup of tea, red rose, the kind her grandmother had kept in an old tin, and she sat at the island and she thought. She was 41 years old. She was the daughter of a Ghanaian-Canadian pharmacist and a woman from Antigonish who had taught high school English for 32 years. She had a master's degree in journalism that she'd never fully used. She had a home that she'd designed down to the grout lines in the bathroom tile. She had a husband who had cleared his calendar and not told her why. She thought about all of this very carefully. Then she picked up her phone and called her friend Saoirse. "I need you to help me find something out," she said. Saoirse Mackinnon had been Renata's closest friend since they'd shared a house in the Plateau during their 20s. She worked in HR for a mid-sized tech firm in downtown Montreal, which meant she had certain practical skills and a certain calibrated distrust of men in nice suits. She did not ask a lot of unnecessary questions. "What am I looking for?" Saoirse said. "I don't know yet," Renata said. "I think I need to start at the beginning." The beginning, as far as Renata could tell, was about 8 months ago. She hadn't noticed it right away because she'd been distracted. Her father had had a health scare in February, a minor cardiac event that turned out to be less serious than the initial call had suggested. But for 3 weeks, she'd been flying back and forth to Halifax and managing her parents' household and trying to keep everything from falling apart on both ends. Trent had been supportive, or what passed for supportive in his register. He'd told her to take as much time as she needed. He'd handled the dog, he'd sent flowers to her parents. By the time things settled down, there was already a distance she couldn't name. She'd assumed it was stress. His firm had brought on a major new client in the spring. A Vancouver-based infrastructure company that needed a lot of hand-holding and a lot of travel. Trent was in and out of the city every few weeks. She'd filled her own time with a freelance contract she'd picked up through an old colleague. A long piece for a national magazine about housing policy in mid-sized Canadian cities, which had ended up being more interesting than she expected and had reminded her uncomfortably of what it felt like to do real work. She'd assumed it was just a rough patch. She was good at assuming. The thing about Trent was that he was not, on the surface, an obvious candidate for the kind of betrayal Renata was now beginning to map in her mind. He was even-tempered and organized. He coached youth hockey in the winters, badly with great enthusiasm. He had strong opinions about municipal politics and genuinely read the books people recommended to him. In the early years of their marriage, he had been the person she told everything to. Somewhere between then and now, she had stopped telling him things. She hadn't noticed when it happened. That was the part that kept snagging at her. Saoirse called back that evening. Renata was in the garden, raking leaves that had come down in the wind the night before, and she answered with her gloves still on. "His firm filed an expense report for a hotel in Quebec City last month," Saoirse said. She worked around corporate systems the way other people worked around traffic, efficiently, without moral confusion. 2 nights. The billing name is his company card. But the check-in was on a Thursday when he told you he was in Ottawa. Renata kept raking. How do you know he told me he was in Ottawa, she said. Because you texted me that you were going to use the time to work on the piece, and you asked me if I wanted to come over for dinner Saturday. Renata remembered. She'd made shakshuka and they'd opened a bottle of Niagara Riesling and watched something forgettable on television. Okay, she said. Renata, I know. What do you want to do? She thought about the cleared calendar. She thought about the flowers he'd sent her parents. She thought about the miscarriage she'd grieved alone in the bathroom. I want to know everything, she said, and then I want to be very careful. She did not confront Trent. She knew that if she confronted him too early, she would lose the advantage. And she was beginning to understand, with the cold clarity that comes after years of not letting yourself see something, that she needed an advantage. Because Trent was not just her husband. He was also the primary person, whose name was on the mortgage, on the firm's operating account, on 3 investment portfolios she had largely left to him to manage, because he'd said he was good at it and she'd believed him. She had been, she was realizing, very trusting. Over the next 2 weeks, she moved carefully. She called her accountant, her own, the one she'd kept from before they were married, a woman named Philippa, who had an office on Sherbrooke Street and a way of explaining things that never made Renata feel stupid. She asked Philippa to run a full picture of her personal financial exposure. Philippa did not ask unnecessary questions either. She called back 4 days later, with information that made Renata sit down on the stairs. Trent had restructured the firm the previous spring. He'd done it quietly, through a corporate lawyer Renata had never met, and the restructuring had shifted the ownership of several assets, including the equity Renata had contributed from her own savings in the early years, into a holding company in which she held no stake. She had signed documents. She remembered signing them. He'd told her they were routine. She'd been distracted probably by something, the dog, dinner, her parents, her own work. She'd signed. Is this reversible? She asked Philippa. That depends on how the marriage ends, Philippa said. Renata heard herself take a breath. I see, she said. She called a family lawyer the next morning. His name was Winston Gozi, and he had been recommended by a colleague of Philippa's, and he had the kind of quiet authority that suggested he had sat across from a lot of people in exactly this situation. He listened to everything Renata told him without interrupting. You did the right thing coming in before anything changed, he said when she was finished. A lot of people wait too long. I still don't know exactly what I'm dealing with, she said. You know enough, he said. The question is what you want the outcome to be. She thought about her house. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the way Trent used to wake up early on Saturday mornings and bring her coffee before she was fully awake, and the way she used to think that meant something permanent. I want to be protected, she said. Whatever happens, I want to make sure I'm not left with nothing. Winston nodded. Then let's start there. She found out about the woman in the 3rd week of October. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. There was no lipstick on a collar, no accidental text. She was going through the mail. She'd started going through the mail, something she hadn't done in years because Trent handled it. And she found a receipt from a jewelry store on Green Avenue. A custom piece. A pendant. Engraved. The engraving said for C, who makes everything worth it. She held the receipt in both hands for a very long time. Then she put it back in the envelope, put the envelope at the bottom of the pile, and went to start dinner. She did not cry until she was in the shower later that night, with the water running hot and the exhaust fan on, which she'd learned was the only reliable privacy in a marriage. She stood under the water until it went cold, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. The pendant, the hotel in Quebec City, the cleared calendar, the document she'd signed without reading. And when the water ran cold, she turned it off and got out and dried her hair and went to bed. Trent was already asleep beside her. He was sleeping fine. That, maybe more than anything, was what she needed to understand. She lay in the dark and she made her decisions. She did not change her behavior. That was the hardest part. Continuing to be Renata Weller, wife, the woman who remembered the dry cleaning, and confirmed dinner reservations, and asked about the Vancouver client with the right amount of interest. She was very good at it. She had been doing it for years. Trent noticed nothing. That hurt in its own particular way, not because she wanted to be caught, she didn't, but because it confirmed how little attention he was paying. She had become, in his field of vision, a kind of furniture, present, functional, unremarkable. She worked. The housing piece had been picked up by a second outlet, and she was expanding it into something longer, and the work kept her sane in a way she hadn't expected. She came back to it every morning with a focus that felt almost physical. It was the one part of her life that was entirely hers. In early November, she met with Winston again. He had spent the past few weeks reviewing the corporate restructuring with a colleague who specialized in business asset disputes. The short version, he said, is that the transfers were not as clean as they were probably meant to be. There are grounds to challenge the restructuring. The contribution you made from personal savings in the early years of the firm is documentable, and a court would likely take a dim view of the way the assets were moved without your meaningful consent. He'll fight it, Renata said. He'll try, Winston said. But here's what matters. If we move now, before he knows you're moving, we're in a much stronger position than if we wait for him to act first. She looked at him across the desk. She thought about the word now. What does moving look like? She said. You file. You secure the documentation. You make sure your name is on the things it needs to be on. And you find somewhere to go. I own this house too, she said. You co-own it. Which means if things become adversarial, staying there during proceedings can get complicated. He paused. Do you have family in the city? My friend Sears, she said. And I have a sister in Toronto. Think about which feels right, he said. You don't have to disappear. You just have to not be caught off guard. She drove home slowly, through streets that were already doing their November thing. Bare branches, early dark, the particular gray of a Montreal afternoon that she had loved for years, and now found she needed to look at very deliberately, in case it was the last autumn she spent in this city. She called her sister that night. Her sister Tamsin was 4 years younger, and had always been the more decisive of the two. She worked as a project manager for a construction firm and lived in a house in the East End of Toronto with her partner and their 2 kids. Come, Tamsin said, before Renata had finished explaining. I'm not ready yet, Renata said. I need another few weeks. Okay, Tamsin said. But when you're ready, you come here first. Not a hotel. Here. Renata pressed the phone against her cheek. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Tamsin said. Just be careful. She found out the woman's name by accident. She hadn't been looking for it specifically. She had deliberately avoided looking, because she found she didn't want to know. Not yet, not until she was far enough along in what she was building that the knowing wouldn't knock her sideways. But Trent had left his phone on the counter one evening when he went to answer the door, and she glanced down without thinking, the way you glance at anything within your eye line. And she saw the name at the top of his messages. Celia, just the name. She didn't read the message. She didn't need to. Celia, for C, who makes everything worth it. She went back to slicing the onion she'd been working on. Her hands were steady. She was a little surprised by that. She'd expected them to shake, but they didn't. She sliced through the rest of the onion and moved on to the garlic, and by the time Trent came back to the kitchen she was completely composed. Who was that? She asked. Kures, he said. Left a package with the neighbors. She nodded. She handed him a glass of wine. That night she lay awake for a long time, but not because she was upset in the way she would have been 3 months ago. She was running through timelines. She was checking the sequence of things in her head. She was making sure she hadn't missed a step. She hadn't. The last week of November, she filed. Winston filed on her behalf on a Tuesday morning. By the time Trent sat down at his desk that day, there were legal proceedings underway that he didn't know about yet. By the time he found out, later that afternoon when his own lawyer called him, Renata had already transferred the funds from their joint account into an account in her name alone, as Winston had advised, not aggressively, not everything, but enough to cover her for the months ahead. She had already photographed every document in the Home Office. She had already backed up 11 years of shared financial records onto an encrypted drive that lived in her bag. She was at Seors's apartment when he called. She let it ring. He called 4 more times. She let each one ring. Then she sent a text. I know everything, Trent. My lawyer's name is Winston Gozi. Please have your lawyer contact him. Don't call me again tonight. She put the phone down and looked at Saoirse. Saoirse had opened a bottle of something good. A burgundy from a place she kept mentioning that Renata had never made it to. And she poured 2 glasses and set one in front of Renata without saying anything. Renata picked it up. She took a slow breath. For the first time in months, the air in the room felt like it had some oxygen in it. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "Nobody ever does," Saoirse said. "That's not the part you were supposed to control." What happened next was in fact quite messy. Trent hired a lawyer, an aggressive one, from a firm that had a reputation for drawing proceedings out, which Winston had anticipated. There were several weeks of what felt like weather. Heavy, unpredictable, the kind that forces you to cancel plans and stay closer to home. Trent's first move was to challenge the fund transfer. His second was to propose a settlement that Winston described, with professional restraint, as not serious. His third was to show up at Saoirse's building one evening, which was when Renata drove to Toronto. Tamsin picked her up at Union Station at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, in her van, still wearing paint-stained clothes from a project she'd been managing that day. "You look terrible," Tamsin said. "Thank you," Renata said. You look like you've been running a marathon." "I've been running a marathon." Tamsin drove her through the city, through streets that looked different from Montreal, in the way Canadian cities look different from each other. Same general grammar, different accent, and Renata watched through the window and felt, slowly, a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying begin, slightly, to lift, not because she was safe. She wasn't fully safe yet. But because she was somewhere Trent hadn't built anything around her. She slept in Tamsin's spare room, under a quilt that smelled like cedar, and for the first time in months she slept deeply and without waking. The proceedings ran through the winter. They were not pleasant. Trent's lawyer made several attempts to characterize Renata as financially dependent and professionally inactive. Which was, she noted with some bitterness, the direct result of choices they had made together, which she had been the one to implement. Winston pushed back on every point with the calm persistence of someone who had done this many times before. The corporate restructuring was the central issue. It took 3 months of forensic accounting and 2 rounds of expert testimony. But Philippa and the specialist Winston had brought in were able to reconstruct a clear paper trail showing the origin and movement of Renata's contributions to the firm's early capital. The picture it painted was not flattering to Trent. His lawyer's tone changed after the second expert report. In March, they reached a settlement. It was not everything Renata had wanted. It never is. But it was fair, genuinely fair, in the way that Winston had told her to measure fair. Not what felt like justice in the abstract, but what she could build something real from going forward. She kept the Westmount house. She received a structured payout for her contributions to the firm. She was awarded a portion of the investments proportional to the years she had been involved in managing them. Trent moved into an apartment in the Plateau. She heard through Saoirse, who heard from somewhere, that Celia was from Ottawa originally and had been working with his firm for just over a year. That was all she let herself know. She was sitting in the house, her house now, on a Saturday morning in April, the first warm Saturday after a long winter, with the back door open to the garden and the dog asleep in the patch of sun on the kitchen floor, when she let herself sit with all of it for a moment. The papers were signed. The accounts were sorted. The long negotiation was over. She made tea, red rose, her grandmother's kind, and she sat at the island where she'd sat 8 months ago after finding the cleared calendar, and she took stock. She was 41 years old. She had a house and a dog and a sister in Toronto, and a friend who had opened a good bottle of Burgundy at exactly the right moment. She had a piece of journalism she was proud of, and an editor who wanted her to pitch something new, and Philippa, and Winston, and her parents still healthy in Halifax, and the garden, which would need a lot of work this spring. She had, she realized, quite a lot. Not the 11 years. Those were complicated now, in ways she didn't yet know how to sort. A mixture of real things and things she'd been telling herself were real. And she suspected it would take a while to work out which was which. But she was not going to spend this particular morning untangling that. That was winter work. The dog shifted in the sun and let out a long sigh. The theatrical kind dogs do when they've decided a moment is comfortable enough to fully commit to, and Renata looked at him and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the notes for the new piece. Something about water infrastructure in northern communities, which was bigger than she'd originally realized and kept pulling her in. She started to write. Outside, through the open door, she could hear a cardinal in the maple at the back of the garden. The city was waking up. The light was the soft, tentative kind that comes in early April in Quebec, not quite warm yet, but pointing at warm, like a door left open just wide enough. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping, and it was the best writing she had done in years.